Hey, and welcome to today's podcast. Today's podcast is on how to be a better storyteller in a business setting. We'll go ahead and go through this. We'll first define what it is to be a storyteller in a business setting, and then we'll take it from there. So I have with me Rahul, Peter, welcome. My name is Chaz with Magnetic Speaking. Let's dive right on into this. So, first thing, let's define storytelling in a business setting. So, Peter, would you please go through and just to set this definition so we're all on the same page?
Sure. When you look in a business setting, there's two types of stories that you have to think about. One is the overarching narrative of your presentation. You can call that a story. Sometimes that's confusing. However, don't be confused. Just relax. Your presentation has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. So you can call that a narrative. That's one type of a story. The second type of story in a business setting are the vignettes. So along this narrative, the arc that you go through for your presentation, there are spots in there where you go tell smaller stories. They could be customer success story, they can be lessons learned stories, they can be your personal story, they can be any story you want to tag on here, customer failure story, whatever it is. These are vignettes that they go over. And the whole purpose in a business setting is to influence people, to engage them, to get them from point A to point B. So the arc should take them from point A to point B, and the vignettes should engage them and keep them along for the ride.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And Rahul, I want to bring you in here. So, oftentimes people will say they want to be a better storyteller. What is a good way that they can think about this in terms of being a better storyteller?
Yeah, so when we hear that, it's immediately what the distinction is between what Peter was just talking about, where when I hear it most of the time, I think, okay, they're probably saying they want to have a longer arc from point A to point B in their presentation. They want to tell a good story. So there's a distinction between that, as Peter said, and then putting vignettes in. Most of the time people are actually referring to both, which is why it can sound a little bit overwhelming or sound like there's a lot, which is why also Peter mentioned that too. So I would split those into two. There's your overall narrative, your longer story that you're trying to tell. That's more of your messaging. And then these vignettes that you want to put in. Can you tell a customer success story when you're trying to make a point? Can you tell a lessons learned story? Can you zoom into a moment and exemplify something that happened? You can say last week, this is what something happened on our team, and this is what the lesson that we learned from it. So that's a good way to start practicing using stories just for the opinions and points that you're trying to make. If you're someone that is used to using data and analysis and reasoning to make your points, next time try to just put in a story. If something happened yesterday on the team, or something happened in your personal life even, and how would you move that into a story context? So that way you're making things more real, you're making it more entertaining, and there isn't a single executive or leader that we know that doesn't tell stories and doesn't tell these vignettes. That's a key distinction that we make as well.
Absolutely. And I think a key point in that is that you said zooming in. This is something that I notice people sometimes do, but most of the times they aren't really good at. So, would you just define what is zooming in and why is it good for stories?
Oh man, you have to zoom in. You absolutely have to zoom in, and that means think of the story as a snapshot moment in time. You're capturing that moment. So rather than trying to be general and talk about, oh, you went on vacation last year and you talk about the whole 2 weeks, that's a recipe for being way too general and rambling. Because then all of a sudden you're talking about the last 2 weeks of what you did. It's too much. Instead, you could say, the first night that we landed in Hawaii, this is what happened. And that's going to capture people in immediately. I don't know about you, but when I say the first night we landed, I'm immediately visualizing something. You're probably visualizing something even though you don't even know what I'm talking about yet. You're thinking, oh, getting off the plane or whatever it might be. So that's what it is to zoom into a moment. It'll make it more efficient when you're telling the story so you're not rambling. It'll make it more lively and entertaining to listen to, and it'll help people visualize. So you absolutely have to zoom in when you're telling the story. It's just going to make it more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know when we're working with people, some of the things that they will have come up in a story is they will tell it over months long. And it's like zoom in very specifically, like you said, that first experience and really zoom into that first experience. So thank you for sharing that, Rule.
Mhm.
Peter, I want to bring you back in here for this next part. I want to move on to the whole idea when people come to us and they say, I want to be a better storyteller, I want to get better at stories. I think that first part we defined it. That's imperative. You have to know what to do to be a better storyteller. Now, after you zoom in, that's a good point too. But how does someone get better? How do they develop this storytelling muscle? What are exercises they can do? What's a long term path they can do? How can they think about just getting better one step at a time?
The first thing you need to realize is that we're all storytellers. And if you are a human being, then you have stories. If you've lived for over one day on earth, you have stories. That's the first realization. And that's an important one because I remember when I first started in public speaking, I came from engineering to public speaking. And in the beginning, I thought, I'm not a good storyteller. I don't have stories. I am not a storyteller to begin with. I'm a numbers guy. Give me a spreadsheet. I can analyze it left, right, up, down, and be comfortable with it. But you tell a story, I'll fumble. And I had to change that belief system that I had. And I adopted a new one that I am a storyteller. And the best thing to do is to start paying attention to your life and divide it into small micro increments instead of looking like with a broad stroke about your life where everything combines with everything else. Start compartmentalizing. And when you start compartmentalizing, like, hey, my story getting out of bed, that's a story. Then my story brushing my teeth, that's a story. My story setting up my camera, that's a story. My story making up my coffee, that's a story. Notice like every single one, if you zoom in, is a story. Now, maybe they're not all interesting. However, let's say you go to to set up the coffee machine and it blows up. Now, that's an interesting story. Makes sense? If you start looking at your life from snapshot perspective, that's the first step because it's gonna first teach you that you are a storyteller, teach you that you have stories in your life, and then you start filtering. Like, is this a story I can use? Is this a story I can't use? And then as you filter, then you realize whenever you need it, one story would pop in your head and you would use it.
That's great. And you said something in there, Peter. Interesting story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't have interesting stories, how do we know? Because in one of the trainings we do, we say, don't worry about your story being boring. That's okay. So how can people find this difference between, oh, I don't want to tell that, that's a boring story, or my story's boring, I don't know how to do that? How can they either think about this in a way that they can tell more interesting stories, or how can they actually tell more interesting stories and craft those stories to be interesting?
Yeah, I think a good perspective is to maybe not look at it interesting versus not interesting, because from our perspective, all stories are interesting. However, you can say some stories are more interesting than others, and that depends on the audience and the topic and where you're using the story, and also how you're telling the story. For example, you can talk about, yeah, I went on vacation last week, like Rahul said, or you can say, I remember distinctly the first day we landed in Hawaii. Like all of a sudden, that made it more interesting. Notice just telling the story in a specific way makes it more interesting. So the lesson here is don't think of your stories as interesting or not interesting. Just think of them as interesting and more interesting. And how do you make them, more interesting all the time?
That's a great way. There is no bad story. There's
There's no bad,
no
exactly.
bad story. Thank you, Peter. Well, I want to bring Rahul back in here. And I want to flip this question to you, Rahul. So, in terms of you as a storyteller, Rahul as a storyteller, did that always come naturally to you, or was it something that you had to build up one step at a time?
Absolutely not in a business context. Absolutely not. I would tell stories pretty naturally in social situations or with friends and things like that. And they even to a point where some of my friends will look to me to tell the story of something that happened. And then in the business context, I noticed at work I would never tell stories. This didn't happen. And probably there's different hesitations that people have. I know one that's common is it's not professional. Another, honestly, was just I felt like I wasn't bringing as much of my personality early on into my career, into my work setting in larger spaces because I was just not confident in terms of speaking into larger groups. Maybe one-on-one, I was speaking to a colleague, and especially if they're a young grad or something like that, maybe I felt more comfortable and then I would tell funny stories or something. But it just wouldn't come out when I was making a point in a meeting. It'd be much more analytical. I would be sticking to facts and research that I'd done, things like that. So absolutely didn't come natural in a business setting. But I really like what Peter's point is, which is, there's interesting stories and more interesting stories. And one thing that you do have to learn how to do in storytelling, we teach this in our boot camp, is that you have to learn how to frame your stories at the end or in the beginning. So the frame is what is the meaning? What is the lesson that we all need to take away from the story, right? And that's going to ensure that you don't just tell a story at work and people are like, dude, why does Chaz keep telling these stories? They're so weird, or like, don't make any sense, or something like that. Like, you don't want that. So that way you ensure you tell a story and then you go, okay, where am I going with this? And that's a frame. You go, okay, this tells us this, or, I realized this. And, that really shows us how important it is to build a certain process. So that way people go, oh, when Chaz or Rahul tells a story, they always have a point that they're trying to make. So that is a key distinction at work. And maybe that was another hesitation. I didn't want to tell a story. And it was just, and honestly, because stories are so useful, you can get away with the story just being entertaining. And you just tell it and people, because the purpose is just to get people to laugh or they're just engaged and maybe lightens the mood a little bit or something in the meeting. That's totally fine. But I think I was afraid that I would tell the story and then go, so anyway, like, I don't know why I said that story. I was trying to prevent that situation, so I just didn't say it.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because I think you can tell fun stories in a business context, and that's fine for the purpose of connecting with people and having fun. But I think the key difference in what we're talking about in this podcast here is for a business purpose. Stories for a business purpose, so in a presentation or conveying your point for work that you're doing. So I think that is that key difference. So don't shy away from telling fun and interesting stories when you're just enjoying your colleagues. Yes, go for it. But I think that is a good point too of how you started to develop your storytelling skills for a specific purpose for work-related activities. So thank you for that, Rahul. And Peter, I saw you raise your hand here, so I want to bring you back in. Please share your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that, okay, we're talking about vignettes and we're talking about stories and we're talking about narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that every presentation needs to have anecdotes or stories. Sometimes you're presenting to the executives. Let's say they give you a part to present in a board meeting and you have 5 minutes. I don't think you have enough time to tell a story. And you probably should not tell a story in those 5 minutes. I would say stick to the facts and embed yourself within the big narrative the CEO and the C-suite are trying to tell. And if you're part of the C-suite, then just stick to that narrative. Now, where stories shine are when you're in a team meeting, when you have more time, when you're doing your job interview presentation, you have 45 minutes and you embed a couple of stories in there. When you're doing a sales presentation, when you're doing a training, when you're doing a kickoff meeting, when you're doing your technical presentation and you want to lighten things up and make things relatable. One group that we worked with are the data team at Facebook. And one of the reasons they came to us because they were telling facts, and sharing data with everyone. However, they felt like people could not relate to the data. So we taught them how to tell better stories so they would marry the data with another story that makes it relatable and tangible to the audience. And that in that context, it works great.
Absolutely. The lessons learned story that came out of it. Yeah,
Exactly.
and I'm curious, Peter, For you, where did you find the power of stories? Because you explained you came from an engineering background and more analytical. So what was that click for you? And same thing as Roa, maybe you were good storytelling in social situations, but where was that click for business?
Yeah, for me, I was never a good storyteller in any context.
Any context,
Any
okay.
context. Yeah, like stories. People start telling stories in this direction, I go in that direction.
Uh-huh.
So for me, when I wanted to become a professional trainer, going from engineering, I took acting classes, improv, stand-up comedy. I took classes on how to write, classes on how to communicate, and then I built my confidence and my skills as a presenter. And I started presenting, and I noticed that the engineers in the room would be riveted because I'm sharing facts and studies, and people who are technical would be interested in that stuff. However, most of the other people who are not interested in the topic would be sleeping. So I was talking to my coach at the time, and he recommended that I take a storytelling class. So of course, I go to the storytelling class. I'm thinking to myself, this is a waste of time because I'm not a storyteller. It's not in my genetics. I am an engineer. I don't have any stories. If I tell stories, they're gonna be boring and rambly. And I show up to the training, and I'm sitting around, and in the break, I started talking to the person that was sitting next to me, and I was telling her that, like, why are you here? Because I heard her speak, and she had a great story. I'm saying, like, you're a great storyteller. Like, why are you here? And then she looks back at me and says, Peter, I thought you're a great storyteller. Why are you here? And then all of a sudden, the whole class started rumbling because everybody thought that everybody else is a good storyteller except themselves. And that's when I had the realization that everybody is a storyteller. You just have to really find a good lens to look at your own life so you can extract the stories and share them in an organized way. And in a business setting, like Rahul said, there is a purpose to the story. You're not just sharing stories like with your friends. With your friends, it's easy. You can be like, oh, today I bought some Bitcoin and it crashed. Okay, great. People laugh, funny. That's fantastic. In a business setting, you can't do that. You have to share the story, and then you have to tell them the purpose you shared that story. Otherwise, it will not be a business story. And it took maybe another year after that class where I realized that you need to do that in a business setting.
Interesting. So I want to follow up then on that year. Where did it sink? Did you do some more courses? Did you maybe get a coach, a mentor? Did you read some books? What helped you really solidify that?
Yeah, mostly coaching and feedback, where I could tell, like, after that course, I started using stories in my presentations. So I noticed that, wow, people are more awake, people are more engaged. And however, like, I would, like, at the end of the meeting, they would come and ask me questions, or they would talk to me, and sometimes I realized that they got the wrong message. Like, I was planning to have them think X, but they think Y instead. And after discussing with my coach and thinking and reflecting about it, I realized that I was telling stories to keep them awake. However, I wasn't telling them why I was telling them stories. So they generated their own thinking about the meaning of the story. And they came up with something different than what I intended. And in a business setting, that's not a good thing. And that's when I started to realize that I need to add a point to my story at the end so I can guide them in that direction.
I think what you just said right there is so important. I think that is the key to storytelling in a business context is you can frame the audience's mind in terms of what you want them to take away. I think that's why a lot of people are scared to tell stories and don't tell stories or feel like they don't know how to tell stories, is because they don't want people to walk away with the wrong impression. In which you're right, they may walk away with the wrong impression or the wrong takeaway from it unless you guide them on that takeaway. I think that is the whole key to storytelling in a business context is making it for that purpose and telling them what that purpose is. So I think that's
bingo.
Yep.
Exactly. Bingo. That's so, by the way, you will stand out if you don't add that piece about framing the story or the meaning of the story or the moral of the story. You will be more interesting speaker. However, you will not be a more influential speaker. You want to be interesting and influential. And that's why you add the frame. So make sure you always add a frame, or you're going to sound like a grandpa telling
There we
stories.
go. No one wants to sound like a grandpa or grandma. I mean, of
No.
course, unless that's what you're going for and you are one, then
That's
great.
right. That's right.
Be
You
one.
know,
But if you don't want to be one, then make sure you frame it.
that's right.
All right, guys. Well, Rahul, I'm bringing you back in here. So, as we're wrapping up here, what are your final thoughts and final takeaways that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Storytelling can have a huge impact on whether or not you even get the job that you want. Because we just had a client last year who he came to the storytelling bootcamp and he worked on his personal story. So this personal story is, how do you talk about yourself? And guess what happens the first question in an interview? Tell me about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the question usually that the interviewer can tell whether the interviewee blew it or not. Because I don't know about you. One time I got like a 10-minute answer and I had to stop them. And they were going on. And then I also got like a 20-second, like, blah, blah, just like 10, 15 seconds, like, oh yeah, this is what I do, and this is why I'm here. I'm like, okay. So it needs to be, a fully fleshed out, why are you interested in the role? How do you connect to this topic or whatever it might be? And that could make or break your job. So there's so many different reasons why you want to be working on stories. It could be getting the job that you want. It could be keeping the job that you want. It could be getting influence in your company with your executives. So there's all different reasons why. And so you want to keep that in the forefront of your mind. And Peter eliminated, for a lot of you out there, a lot of your excuses. So saying like, oh, I'm an engineer, or oh, I don't tell stories. It's not my, she even mentioned genetics or whatever it is. So there's really no excuse. We've seen clients that don't ever think about stories, who now tell stories much more naturally. It's just a muscle, just like any other, and you've got to train it and work it out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rahul. And on that note too, it's an important part to not sound scripted in that tell me about yourself question. Although you may be following a script, it's important because I was talking to someone the other day and she had got feedback that she did sound scripted, and that is possibly due to nerves and feeling like you're just very focused and in the zone. So it's definitely important to have that story, and also something, if anyone does storytelling bootcamp with us that we offer, you'll see it's about the delivery of it as well and not sounding scripted. So I think that's a key point you're putting in there too. Peter, any last thoughts?
You can be a great storyteller if you put your energy there. All you need is the structure of storytelling and ways to deliver a story and practice. And you will never look back. I never look back right now. I can't imagine a time right now where I give a presentation, except for a board meeting, where I wouldn't share a story.
That's powerful. And as one of the big key takeaways from this as well is to frame that story. That's the big point here. I think that we're all emphasizing in our 20 minutes here, it's the framing of that story, giving them the takeaway in the business context, having that purpose. That's how you be influential and not just another storyteller. Well, thank you for joining us, and be sure to catch us on the next podcast. We'll see you then. Bye for now.